there are some disadvantages to crowns, but otherwise, they're quite important things.
Camilla will be known as Queen Consort as she continues her own loyal service.
Something doesn't add up, because in the quietest corners of Windsor, behind polished doors and rehearsed smiles, a decision was made that has left powerful people stunned, sidelined, and quietly furious. Not William, not Charles, not even the seasoned figures who've spent decades orbiting the throne. No, the name echoing through private conversations, tight-lipped, tense, almost disbelieving, is Charlotte, a 9-year-old girl. And somehow, she's at the center of a royal move so precise, so deliberate, it feels less like inheritance and more like a calculated message sent from beyond the grave. Because this wasn't just about land. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, legacy, and a silent warning that some within the royal circle didn't see coming until it was already too late. An estate, hidden, unlisted, deliberately erased from public awareness, suddenly surfaces in February 2026. Not in headlines at first, not in announcements, but in whispers. A property so carefully protected that even seasoned royal watchers had never heard of it. No registry, no ceremony, no paper trail accessible to the public. And yet, it had been there all along, quietly guarded through generations, carrying something far heavier than its walls and acres could suggest. And when the truth finally emerged, when the sealed documents were opened, it didn't just shock the institution. It disrupted expectations that had been building quietly for years. Because some people thought they knew how this story would end. They thought they understood the Queen's intentions. They thought they had time. They thought they had influence. They were wrong. Let's slow down for a second, because the deeper you go into this, the stranger it becomes. This estate, tucked away between Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire, was never meant to be seen. Purchased in 1944 during one of the most fragile moments in British history, it wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about status. It was about protection, a sanctuary, a vault, a place where the most sensitive pieces of royal history could exist, untouched by politics, untouched by scrutiny, untouched by anyone who might see value in exploiting it. And Queen Elizabeth II didn't just inherit it, she guarded it. Quietly, relentlessly, almost obsessively. No press, no announcements. Just silent visits, expanding archives, preserving documents no one outside those walls would ever read, walking through its grounds like someone protecting something sacred, something fragile, something irreplaceable. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because someone else had access, someone who didn't treat it like an asset, but like a responsibility. Prince William. Between 2017 and 2021, he made private, unannounced visits. No cameras, no statements, no public credit, just long hours inside archival rooms, handling letters from soldiers who never returned, restoring systems that protected fragile documents, organizing history piece by piece like it actually mattered to him. And Queen Elizabeth noticed. Of course she did. She always noticed. But while everyone else assumed this story would naturally pass from monarch to monarch, from king to king, Elizabeth was already thinking further ahead, past William, past the obvious choices. She was watching someone else, Charlotte. And this is where the story stops being predictable and starts becoming intentional, because this wasn't a last-minute decision. This wasn't sentimental. This wasn't random. It was observed, measured, decided years in advance. Charlotte wasn't loud. She wasn't attention-seeking. She didn't perform for the cameras the way people expect children to. She watched. She listened. She absorbed. There was a stillness to her, something unsettlingly composed for someone so young. And that's what stood out, because Queen Elizabeth had seen what happens when legacy becomes opportunity. She had witnessed ambition twist responsibility into something self-serving. She had watched carefully as people navigated proximity to power, not always with the institution's best interest at heart. So when she looked at Charlotte, she wasn't just seeing a granddaughter, she was evaluating a future custodian, someone who wouldn't exploit, someone who wouldn't rush to monetize, someone who understood instinctively that some things aren't meant to be touched by profit. And that realization didn't stay in her thoughts. It became law, a private covenant, sealed, witnessed, hidden away in her personal legal archive, not publicly filed, not casually drafted. This was engineered, structured, protected by layers of legal precision designed to activate only under specific conditions. Conditions that eventually were met. And when they were, everything changed. Because at the exact moment certain individuals believed they were stepping closer to control, the system Elizabeth built quietly snapped into place. And suddenly, doors that once seemed open slammed shut. Now let's talk about the part no one wants to say out loud, but everyone inside those walls understands. There were plans, carefully constructed, strategically developed, quietly advanced behind the scenes. And they weren't small, they weren't harmless, they were ambitious. Because while the estate was being preserved in silence, others were imagining something very different. Something louder, something profitable, something public. What was being pitched internally sounded elegant on the surface. A cultural legacy center. Respectful, refined. Something that could be framed as honoring history. But underneath that polished language, a completely different reality. A high-end transformation. A commercial empire disguised as heritage. Fine dining experiences inside historic structures. Exclusive retreats. Luxury branding. Elite clientele from across the globe. Carefully curated products tied to royal imagery. Not preservation, not protection. Transformation. And the deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. This wasn't about honoring the past, this was about monetizing it, turning decades of quiet preservation into a curated, profitable experience. And the timing? Not accidental, because these ideas didn't appear overnight. They had been building, positioning, waiting for the right moment, the right opening, the right assumption that eventually control would shift. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Queen Elizabeth had already seen it years earlier, and instead of confronting it, instead of challenging it publicly, she did something far more devastating. She prepared for it. In silence, every clause, every condition, every restriction written with a level of foresight that feels almost unsettling in hindsight. Because when the sealed documents were finally opened on February 3rd, 2026, it wasn't just a transfer, it was a shutdown. A complete, irreversible, legally airtight shutdown of every pathway that could have allowed that estate to become anything other than what she intended. No commercial conversion, no branding, no exploitation, not without permission that quite simply would never be given. And just like that, years of quiet planning collapsed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with four walls of legal certainty that no one could break. And the people who thought they had time, they realized they never did. And what makes this even more unsettling is how cleanly it all unraveled. Because the moment those sealed documents were released into the inner circle on February 3rd, 2026, the atmosphere inside Windsor didn't explode. It froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Legal advisors, people who had spent decades navigating the most complex royal frameworks, sat in silence, rereading clauses as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. But they didn't. Every line was deliberate, every restriction absolute, and every assumption that had been quietly built over the past 2 years, gone, instantly. Because here's the part no one can ignore. The plan that had been forming behind the scenes wasn't just speculative. It was already in motion. Meetings had been held. Partnerships had been discussed. Investors, serious investors, had been approached. There were projections, models, even early-stage branding concepts circulating privately among those who believed they were preparing for an inevitable transition. And at the center of that momentum was the belief that access to this estate would eventually be negotiable. But Elizabeth had already closed that door, not metaphorically, legally. And the precision of how she did it, that's what left people shaken. Because buried inside that covenant wasn't just a simple transfer of ownership. It was something far more calculated, a delayed activation mechanism, meaning nothing changed at the moment of her passing. Nothing triggered immediately. Instead, the entire structure remained dormant, waiting until very specific conditions only she defined, were fulfilled. Which means this wasn't reactive. This wasn't written in response to pressure. This was preemptive. She knew exactly what might happen, and she wrote an answer to it years before it ever surfaced. Now pause and really think about that. What kind of foresight does it take to anticipate not just conflict, but the exact shape of that conflict? Because this wasn't vague protection, this was targeted. The covenant didn't just restrict general misuse, it explicitly blocked commercial transformation, brand exploitation, structural alteration, even shared custodianship models that could have slowly shifted control over time. Every loophole, sealed. Every workaround, anticipated. Every potential argument, already answered. And the more legal experts examined it, the clearer it became, this wasn't just estate planning. This was strategy operating at a level that bordered on unsettling, because it suggested something deeper. It suggested she wasn't guessing. She was responding to something she had already seen. And that realization, that quiet implication, is what made the fallout feel personal. Because when certain individuals read those clauses, really read them, they didn't see a neutral legal document. They saw themselves reflected in its restrictions. Now imagine opening an envelope bearing the personal cipher of a monarch who was no longer alive and realizing that every move you had been preparing to make had already been anticipated and neutralized. That's not just disappointment, that's exposure. And according to those present, the reaction in that room wasn't loud. It was something far more telling: silence. Long, heavy, suffocating silence. Because what do you say when you realize you've been outmaneuvered by someone who isn't even here anymore? 4 words eventually broke that silence, quietly, almost under the breath, but sharp enough to linger in the room long after they were spoken. Even in death, she leaves me caged. And if you listen closely to that sentence, it reveals everything. This wasn't being interpreted as policy. It wasn't being framed as procedure. It was understood as control, as limitation, as something that had been designed not just to protect an estate, but to prevent specific people from ever touching it. And from that moment on, the story shifted, because it was no longer about who inherits what. It was about who was never meant to have it. And that's where things started to unravel completely. Because while the legal structure was airtight, there was still something else lurking beneath the surface. Something even bigger. Something that turned what looked like a blocked plan into a full-scale collapse. Green Heath. At first glance, it didn't look like much. A stretch of woodland, quiet, undeveloped, the kind of place easily overlooked if you didn't know what you were looking at. And that's exactly what happened. It was underestimated, misread, dismissed as secondary. But behind that quiet landscape, something had been building for years. A private financial structure, invisible, untouched, quietly accumulating through strategic transfers approved directly by Elizabeth herself. And when the full details surfaced, 37 million, just sitting there, hidden in plain sight. And suddenly, everything changed again, because the commercial projections that had been built, the partnerships, the investor expectations, the projected returns, they weren't just disrupted, they were invalidated, because those projections had been based on incomplete information, assumptions, surface-level understanding of assets that were far more complex than they appeared. And when the truth came out, it didn't just expose a miscalculation, it exposed a gap, a massive gap between what was believed and what actually existed. Investors who had been promised access to something stable suddenly found themselves tied to an asset they didn't understand. Agreements that seemed promising suddenly looked fragile, and the structure that had been carefully assembled, it started to crack. Because by doing that, Elizabeth didn't just choose a custodian, she defined a future where this estate, this hidden, protected, fiercely guarded piece of royal history, would pass into the hands of someone she believed understood something others didn't. That not everything is meant to be used, some things are meant to be protected. And that's where this story becomes something else entirely, because it's no longer about what was lost, it's about what was preserved, and more importantly, why it had to be protected this way in the first place. Because people don't build fortresses like this unless they believe something is coming. And if Elizabeth went this far, this precise, this controlled, this unyielding, then the real question isn't just what she stopped, it's what she saw, and whether that threat is truly gone.